Good afternoon and welcome to today's Shern webinar. My name is Dr. Caitlin Donaldson. I'm a Research Associate in Decipher and I'm going to take on the first half of this presentation and then hand over to my colleague Dr. Rachel Brown, who will do the second half. And today we're going to talk a little bit about learner school connectedness and well-being within the context of the whole school approach to emotional and mental well-being. So I want to start by providing a bit of background to contextualise the research that we're going to present. So firstly, the whole school approach. So as I'm sure probably all of you are aware, in 2021, the Welsh Government introduced statutory guidance on embedding a whole school approach to emotional and mental well-being for all schools in Wales. And this framework has three core values: developing a sense of belonging for staff and students, building a sense of efficacy, and having your voice heard. And these core values link really closely to the concept of school connectedness, which focuses on young people's sense of belonging at school and their relationships with peers and staff. So one way to assess impacts of the whole school approach would be to look at changes in young people's sense of connection to school and whether they've changed over time. School connectedness is really important because it has a protective effect on future anxiety and depression, sexual health behaviours, violence, substance abuse, as well as school truancy and school exclusion. So we decided that it'd be really interesting and important to look at the historical Shern data to explore trends in school connectedness in the years leading up to the implementation of the whole school approach in Wales and shortly thereafter. And it's important to highlight that the whole school approach was not introduced in isolation of other events, in particular the COVID-19 pandemic, which had its own impacts on school connectedness. So by looking at trends over time, we can see the context into which the whole school approach was introduced. So how do we measure school connectedness in Shern? Well, there are 6 outcome measures that we used in this analysis. The first is a measure of learner-teacher relationships based on a summed score of 3 questions that we ask young people. We do the same for peer relationships. We have 3 items that we ask that we sum. The same for learner involvement in decision making, 3 items that we can sum to make a score. We have 1 item that we ask that assesses young people's liking of school, another item that looks at the extent to which they feel a sense of belonging at school, and another item that asks young people to what extent they feel they have an adult to confide in at school. And these 6 outcomes are used within this analysis. So we have data from both primary and secondary schools that we could use to look at trends in school connectedness over time. For primary school, we're focused just on year 6 based on the data that we have available. And the data goes back to 2019. We have 4 data points, 2019 up to 2024. You can see that the sample size increases substantially over that period. For secondary schools, depending on the outcome, some of the outcomes go all the way back to 2001. And again, you can see that over time, those sample sizes have increased. For secondary school, we're able to look at years 7 to 11. So we have 5 different year groups that we can look at. So the first thing I want to do is to present the trends graphs that just give an indication of the mean values of the different outcomes over time. What you can see, this is for primary school data. What you can see is that the graphs here actually appear to be relatively flat. In terms of the whole school approach, the 2021 primary school survey took place between April and July 2021, and then it was in September of the same year that the whole school approach was first introduced. So what we actually have are 2 data points that are prior to the introduction of the whole school approach and 2 data points that are post introduction of the whole school approach. So yes, the graphs look relatively flat. Actually, when you run the analysis statistically for staff-student relationships, the value in 2024 is significantly lower than the value in 2019. However, because we only have 4 data points, I think really we need a bit more data to understand whether that's a meaningful trend. I think what we can see is that things haven't improved over time. These are the remaining 3 trends graphs for primary school data. I think the liking school graph is possibly the one of all 6 of the graphs that shows most evidence of that decline. But actually all 3 of these, the 2024 data is significantly lower than the 2019. So all three of these show evidence of a significant decline in school connectedness over time. As I said with the previous slide, I think we need some more data though to see whether or not this is a meaningful change. But again, what we can see is that there hasn't been improvements in school connectedness over time. We also looked at, for the primary school data, we looked at gender and family affluence effects and whether or not there were any significant differences within these groups after we'd controlled for the cohort effect. So after we controlled for the year that the survey was completed in, was there any evidence of difference between boys and girls or young people with different levels of family affluence? For family affluence for the primary survey, we used 5 items because these were the 5 items that were consistently used across the 4 surveys. So that included asking young people about their number of bathrooms, cars, computers, whether they had their own bedroom, and whether the family had a dishwasher. Those scores were summed from 0 to 10 and treated as continuous within the models. And so what you can see here is that for 4 out of the 6 outcomes, girls had more positive school connectedness in year 6 of primary school. So they had significantly higher learner-teacher relationships, significantly higher perceptions of their involvement in decision making, higher liking school, and a higher perception that they had an adult to confide in at school. There was no significant difference in sense of belonging between boys and girls, but girls did have a significantly lower perception of their peer relationships than boys did. For family affluence, we found for the first 2 outcomes there was no significant evidence that family affluence was having an impact. We found that for 2 of the outcomes, young people with higher affluence had significantly lower perception of school connectedness. That was for their involvement in decision making and having an adult to confide in. So those young people from higher affluence families had lower perceptions of those 2 outcomes, but they had higher perceptions of their sense of belonging and liking school than young people from lower affluence backgrounds. So now I want to come on to the secondary school trends. So as I've highlighted, we've generally got more data for secondary schools. Not all of the outcomes we have data all the way back to 2001, but for some of them we do. So this first slide provides the trends graphs for the staff-student relationships, and student decision making. Just to highlight that in the 2021 secondary school survey took place September to December of 2021. So that was during the first year of implementation. So theoretically, we have 2 data collections after implementation of the whole school approach, 2021 and 2023. And the other data points are prior to introduction of the whole school approach. However, obviously implementation wasn't uniform across schools. A lot of schools were still thinking about what the whole school approach meant to them in 2021. So it's not easy to pinpoint exactly when the whole school approach started, but just for information's sake, really, just to know that that 2021 survey took place at the point that the whole school approach was starting to be implemented. So what you can see here is that we have more data, and it is a bit easier to see evidence of a decline over time in some of these outcomes. And actually for all of the all 6 of the secondary outcomes, we had evidence of significant decline over time. So those here, that's the staff-student relationships, and student decision making. And then we have liking school, school belonging, and adult to confiding as the remaining 3 outcomes for the secondary school. And you can see particularly for liking school and also for school belonging, there is evidence of decline. And actually all 3 of these, statistically speaking, there is evidence of a significant decline in school connectedness over time. So then for the secondary school data, we also wanted to look at whether or not there were any differences based on different demographic characteristics of the young people. So again, we looked at gender, we looked at family affluence, and we were also able to look at age in the secondary school data because we have young people from years 7 up to year 11, whereas in primary it's just year 6. Family affluence is a bit more complicated in the secondary school data because the questions had changed over time. So since 2001 up to the most recent survey, some of the questions had changed and new ones had been added. So what we did was to use the available questions for each of the survey years to create a score for that survey year, and then to divide young people into the lowest third, the middle third, and the top third in terms of their level of family affluence. So what did we find? We found that for gender, 5 out of the 6 outcomes were worse for girls than they were for boys. And this was a little bit different to what we'd seen in the Year 6 data for primary schools, where in primary school, girls had better perceptions of the learner-teacher relationships than boys, better perceptions of their involvement in decision-making. They were more likely than boys to say they liked school. And sense of belonging in the primary, there was no significant difference between boys and girls, whereas now in secondary, you can see that it's significantly lower for girls. In terms of family affluence, you see that it was significantly higher perceptions for young people who were from higher affluence families for 5 out of the 6 outcomes, and there was no significant difference in terms of involvement in decision making. And one of the most consistent findings in the data was that in year 11 and actually in the other years as well, perceptions of school connectedness were significantly lower than they were in year 7, and year 7 was consistently the most positive year in terms of young people's perceptions of school connectedness, and then that tended to decline over time. And then I just wanted to show these graphs. So these are all liking school, and they're all based on the secondary school data, just to give you a sense of what it looks like in terms of the gender, family affluence and school year splits. For this, what you can see is that boys and girls were relatively similar up until about 2019, when there's a bit of a split and girls seem to be declining more quickly than boys. For family affluence, there's been a consistent split between the kind of low, medium and high affluence groups over time, with higher affluence young people tending to have a more positive perception of liking school. And again, with the years, this just shows years 7, 9 and 11 just for illustrative purposes, but you can see that year 7 students, they like school more than those in the other years, and year 11 tends to be the worst, although sometimes year 10, depending on the outcome, actually was seen to be the worst. But that may partly be to do with the young people by year 11 who perhaps are least attached to school, perhaps aren't in school on the days of the survey data collection as well. So you have to be aware of that. So just a quick summary before I hand over to Rachel. The analysis suggests there's been a general decline in school connectedness over time. And while we would like some more data for some of the outcomes, there isn't any evidence at the moment of improvements in school connectedness. Important to point out, we can't separate any effects of the whole school approach from any general trends, COVID-19 and other changes in the system. However, this analysis provides a context for understanding the ongoing trend of school connectedness into which the whole school approach was introduced.
Okay, so I'm going to take over now. My name's Rachel Brown. I'm the research lead for the evaluation of the whole school approach to emotional and mental wellbeing, which has been running in Decipher for the last 3 years, funded by the Wolfson Centre for Young People's Mental Health. So I'm going to talk about an aspect of the research that we've been doing on the whole school approach that complements what you've been hearing from Caitlin, and starts to allow us to think a little bit about some of the explanations that there might be for the trends that we've been seeing. So as part of our mixed methods analysis of the whole school approach, we've worked with 12 case study schools over the last few years. So we did research data collection with them in 2023 and 24, and that involved going back to the same schools and speaking to staff, pupils, and doing observations on site. So what we did is look at any kind of visible indications of the sort of wellbeing activity going on site, anything around the whole school approach specifically, but the broader wellbeing offering in the school. We also looked at school policies in year 1, and then looked again at any changes that might have occurred on the second visit, specifically around any changes in wellbeing policy, any reference to the whole school approach. So we work with 4 primary and 7 secondary and 1 all-age school in Wales as part of that. So I'm going to talk, part of what we had in those interviews was discussions with staff around their views of some of these dimensions of school connectedness. So we talked about relationships within schools, we talked about peer relationships, staff relationships, pupil involvement in school life, and some of the ongoing challenges that had been experienced within that time period. So I'm just going to present you a snapshot of some of our interview findings from staff that are relevant to the trends that Caitlin's been describing to you, and particularly relevant to why those trends in school connectedness seem to be going in a direction that we don't want. So as I said, these are really sort of very brief snapshots, but it's just to give you some indication of what we found. So we asked staff to think about some of the challenges that have been experienced, and one that came up at both time points was the ongoing impact of COVID-19. And that was particularly relevant to some of the issues around connectedness. So in the primary schools that we spoke to, some of the typical kind of issues that people were talking about were things like seeing an increase in developmental and behavioural challenges. And that was manifesting in lots of different ways. So things like the way that children interacted socially and struggles to actually interact in positive ways, including things like not wanting to play or not actually knowing how to play effectively in some cases. We had lots of reports of staff talking about modelling styles of play and styles of social interaction to try to set some examples for young people. But there was a noticeable increase in behaviours like not picking up on social cues and play cues, as well as responding aggressively or inappropriately to what would have been fairly normal sort of cues historically. And that was often contextualised by staff who talked about the cost of living crisis as something that really exacerbated that loss of social interaction in some of their pupils, that as well as some of the isolation experienced through COVID, we were in a situation where families just simply couldn't afford to do some of the social activities that they might have done before and take their children into places where they might have had that chance to interact and learn those social skills and play skills. And our staff in secondary talked about some similar issues, really, particularly the idea of more presentation of emotional and behavioural challenges. So we heard a lot of accounts of an increased number of pupils who were just struggling to regulate in the school environment, particularly in larger settings, so classrooms or crowded spaces like corridors as well was a trigger. Dining areas and playgrounds were things that came up as well. And that meant that more pupils were requesting adjustments within the school day. So things like needing space to step away from those crowded situations. So timeouts to deal with the anxiety that they were experiencing. There were an increase in the number of formal requests to miss particular lessons in the school day, where pupils were saying that they couldn't cope with something about that particular lesson. And that meant a lot of change and a lot of need to try and accommodate all of those particular needs. Some staff observed that they thought pupils' ability to negotiate, to work with peers to solve conflict had changed. And essentially that they maybe had less ability to have those kind of social interactions that might have led to something being resolved without additional conflict. Some talked about feeling like there was less resilience in the pupil population for what might have historically been considered fairly normal interactions and normal disputes with peers, but these were seeming to escalate into bigger issues before being resolved. And again, they talked about the loss of social opportunities. In both primary and secondary, it was observed that after school clubs had suffered a lot during COVID and because of budget cuts, and they provided valuable sort of social time for bonding that had been lost to a lot of pupils. So obviously these are all things that impact that ability to maintain peer relationships within schools. So these all felt pretty significant. Another issue that was talked about across both primary and secondary was the ongoing impact of attendance, which hadn't actually recovered to sort of pre-pandemic levels at either site, and it's been a very slow journey to kind of get that back up to something like pre-pandemic levels. And obviously the main challenge of that is if pupils aren't in school, then they simply can't be connected to the school site because they're just not there to experience those relationships and that feeling of belonging. So there were a lot of impacts of that attendance that are talked about by school staff in our interviews. Firstly, being that lack of opportunity. So you can't build a relationship with a pupil that isn't there. If a pupil's attendance is more fragmented, if they're not regularly seeing a staff member, that chance to connect and have that trusted relationship is obviously a lot lower. As mentioned, again, this was cited that some of the lack of attendance was potentially due to this issue of lower level anxiety that might have historically been overcome, that pupils might have attended before with this, where now they were actually staying out of school. And there were some changes in parental expectations that seemed to be quite significant as well. Some staff felt that in some families, the parents were actually being more supportive of lack of attendance or more accepting of it. And across the board, it was generally seen that there was a higher level of acceptability for children not attending school as much as before. Some also felt that expectations of what schools were able to do could be slightly unrealistic in terms of the speed of getting a service in place for a young person who was experiencing anxiety, or the extent to which schools had the kind of specialist skills to intervene in something that might actually be a mental health challenge that needed more specialist support. So some of those expectations were seen as not being necessarily something a school could do. So we then talked to staff about the kind of things that they've been trying to put in place in their schools to overcome some of these challenges to connectedness. And these, again, are some examples of the sort of things that came out of our interviews. So including reviewing behaviour policies, so focusing on more on a positive reinforcement approach instead of necessarily a more disciplinary based approach. Various initiatives to try to increase attendance, including things like family engagement officers, or trying to offer more to get families on site so that those relationships could be built up more. So a lot more schools were moving towards models of kind of the community hub type approach. So they would offer things like food provision through food banks or cookery classes, which could be done with children. Things like having welfare support advisors on site as well, or other advice services, and trying to offer a more kind of family oriented service with a view that if families felt engaged on site, then it might make pupils feel more engaged as well. And in terms of sort of day-to-day activities, the use of flexible timetables had become an awful lot more common, including hybrid mixed learning with a combination of school and home, or the use of certain areas in a school where pupils could go either for certain lessons or for the whole day. There were efforts to try to reverse that sort of trend of loss of after school clubs and social activities, those kind of more informal social connections, including lunch clubs, breakfast clubs, trying to actually get a range of after school activities back up and running. Another point that was made was that it was quite useful for staff to acknowledge that this had been a shared challenge, that everybody went through the lockdown process, everybody experienced it differently. Things like talking about anxiety as a kind of normal part of human experience, just the idea that acknowledging shared experiences might be helpful in staff-student relationships. We had a couple of examples in primaries of where timetables had actually been changed to allow informal social interaction. So, for example, the first lesson of the day wasn't formal teaching, it was a play session, so people could have that time together. Something that is probably specific to primaries and not really something that could be applied in a secondary setting. There were ongoing challenges. I'm sure these will be very familiar to you. So staff capacity was obviously the biggest in terms of spending more time with a smaller number of pupils with more complex needs and having less time then for things like after school activity or other sort of other activities. Staff wellbeing is still a challenge and has been an ongoing challenge, certainly amplified through the pandemic, which has led to issues around retention and recruitment across the whole sector. And the ongoing issue of lack of resources in the context of budget cuts. A lot of the other sort of additional value activities that are done in schools have been lost, and it's very, very difficult then to get those back in place. So that's a sort of brief summary of some of our findings that are relevant to school connectedness and some of the ongoing challenges in trying to rebuild that connectedness. So it'll be interesting to sort of follow this further and see how this appears in the trends in the future. So just to give thanks to our participating schools and the Wolfson Centre for Young People's Mental Health. And thanks for your time.